This program has been approved for one IDCEC CEU. To receive credit for this program, please submit your full name, IDCEC number, program class code, and your summary essay to ceu@iida.org. The program class code is located alongside the title of this program on the IIDA Academy page. For a certificate of completion to use toward another certifying body, please submit the same information to ceu@iida.org. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Durst, the Executive Vice President and CEO of IIDA, the International Interior Design Association. And I'm so glad that you could join us this afternoon for an incredibly vital and important conversation today. We have a phenomenal panel of leaders, and we're talking about culture as foundation and building equity through design, a continued important topic for our industry, for firms, and for sales organizations. All right, and I am incredibly honored this afternoon to be joined by three professionals in the HR and in the equity space. And let me just note those folks, and also so that everyone knows, Cheryl Kern, who is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for MillerKnoll, is in transit and having some transportation difficulties at the airport. So who among us can't relate to that? So Cheryl will be joining us as soon as she is able. We also have Giselle Santos Rivera. She's the Global Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with HKS. And also joining us is Kimberlyn Daniel, who is the Chief People, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer with IA Interior Architects. All right, and let's see. Hi there, panelists. How are you? Everybody's there and on, and we are ready to get started. How are you both today? Everybody good?
Today is a great day, Cheryl. Doing good. Yes, thank you.
Good. I am so glad. And how about if we start right in, because we've got so much to talk about. Let's talk about the work that you both are doing. And when Cheryl joins us, she can definitely jump in on this conversation. Let's talk about the work that you're doing within the realm of diversity and HR. You're both working very closely with your firms with some very specified and specific goals and new initiatives. Can you each share with us some idea of the work that you're doing? Obviously, this topic has gained importance in the last year or so, but I know that firms have ongoing initiatives as well. So how about if we get started and talk a little bit about what you both are doing with your firms? And whoever wants to start.
Sure, I'll start, Cheryl. Thank you for having me. I'm Kimberlyn Daniel. I am the Chief People, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for IA Interior Architects. I assumed this role in May of 2017. And throughout the course of a very rigorous interview process with my two CEOs and members of the executive team, the conversation went from human resources to really a bona fide discussion, authentic discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, let me just tell you, as a Black girl growing up in the South, having this kind of conversation in a safe space as part of an interview process for a C-level role was the first time I'd ever experienced this. And we can all, chalk it up to, the events of late, post George Floyd, the social unrest movement of late. But what I can tell you about IA is that diversity, equity, and inclusion has always been important to them. It's always been a value of theirs. You fast forward to now, in hiring a role such as mine, the first ever role such as this in the firm, it's now gone from a value to a bona fide business and cultural imperative. And so having my role, especially sitting at the level in which this role sits, I report directly to our two CEOs, it really has sent the signal throughout the firm that we're serious and this is safe. We're looking at everything because at the core, race, equity, inclusion, it is at the base of every decision that we're going to make.
Yeah, yeah, and
It just
Kimberly,
is.
yeah, and you took it personal. You know, you
Yes.
talked about, you know, as a Black woman, what your role means to you. Isel, I'm going to turn to you and tell us a little bit about your role at HKS.
Sure. Thank you again for having me here and for the platform to talk about these issues. Thank you. That's a big deal. So a little bit different than my co-panelist. I'm an architect and a medical planner. So I took on the role of director of JEDI in 2019, but and I'll share a little bit of the governance structure that supported that. The conversations at HKS had started prior to that. And the base of the conversation was gender parity. It was really elevating the conversation of women in the organization, women in leadership, and what that would look like, what that should look like. And we were trying to have very intentional conversations about the future of our organization to make it more supportive and inclusive of women in the organization. So in 2019, after a really wonderful strategic planning process that I was not a part of, the firm decided that they were going to be very intentional in signing on to the UN Global Compact. And in order to sign on to the UN Global Compact, we wanted to define an environmental social governance structure that supported the work that required being signatories to the UN Global Compact. And in addition to supporting the principles of the UN, we wanted to also pursue some of the sustainable development goals. Of course, that also encompasses the UN Global Compact. So in order to do that, two of the SDGs are targeting or specifically wanting to set goals and advancement on gender equity and reduced inequality. So of course, at the time we were thinking, well, we want this to be a holistic experience to tackle all of the UN Global Compact principles and the SDGs. We wanted to create an environmental social governance structure that oversaw all of the initiatives that were setting those goals. So we have in that structure still, we have the Chief Sustainability Officer that targets all the environmental goal setting, our Citizen HKS co-directors, which is social public interest designs part of our business, and then me that tackles a little bit of the governance structure, the social issues, and also the awareness of creating the reduced inequality and gender parity. When that happened, I was doing some work locally in AIDC with an organization that I had founded, WIELD, Women Inspiring Emerging Leaders in Design. And I think as the universe conspires sometimes to put you where you need to get to, my event to elevate representation of women locally happened at the same time that the last strategic council meeting was in DC in the office. So I think it just coincided that the work that I was doing outside of the firm translated into our new strategic vision for what we wanted for the organization. So I was asked to take on the role, but I went from Revit, sitting in front of the computer, doing architecture work and medical planning, to then a corporate directorial role, which was a shift on many aspects. I was doing this already. I recognized the experience that I had had in the industry as a woman, a person of color, English is not my first language, and a lesbian in the space. And I thought, I can't pass this opportunity up. I know what it has looked like for me looking up and not seeing anybody that looked like me. I want to be able to amplify the voices for people in the industry and create change in my firm.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. It's interesting how HKS kind of contoured these kind of multiple thresholds, these multiple milestones and goals into this kind of one umbrella area. Can both of you talk about how your roles have changed or are working to institute change within your firms and how it's affected kind of the culture of your firm? Have you seen differences in the, both of you noted 2017. So have you seen shifts and changes in how your firm thinks about, talks about equity and inclusion in the last few years? Last year in particular, but I'd like to, not just pinpoint this to the past year. As much as things have changed, it is this year was a catalyst for a lot, but certainly, we can look further back than that. So I'd love for both of you to comment on some changes that you've seen in your firms, firm culture, firm practice.
So Cheryl, I joined in May of this year.
Oh, this year. Okay.
Yeah, May of this year.
Okay.
So I'm 6 months in. I'm actually just celebrating my 6-month milestone yesterday. But what I would tell you is that they have always done great DE&I work, but it was done at the local level. And as you can appreciate, every market is different. Every studio is different. What needs, opportunities, interests are, in Miami look very different than what they could possibly be in Boston. Right. What my role has done, and me being on board in just 6 months, what this has done has really elevated the conversation. I'm now, reporting directly to the CEOs. I am leading diversity for the firm. And now we're looking at the firm goals more holistically, not going to, lose sight of the entrepreneurial spirit that has made IA, but this is important enough where it needs to have corporate-wide attention. And so I'm now putting a little bit more rigor around our work. I'm now putting into place, measures, where we are and where we want to be. We have a 5-year plan, that we're in the midst of working through. Clock already started from 2021 to 2026. My being hired is a part of that plan. And one of the first things I did when I joined was I looked at our representation. It wasn't, a very, very hard exercise to see that we had huge opportunities when you look demographically at what we looked like. I don't believe for one moment that there are not qualified people of color who can fill senior roles within our firm. We just have to make it a priority and put the work in place to get to the goals we're trying to hit. Yeah. And so my role and, and my associated team that I have built and that I'm continuing to build is really working at the firm level, but also at the local level to get those processes in place, to look at operationally what we can do differently to be more equitable and more inclusive, even down to something as simple as job descriptions. Does that role really need a 4-year bachelor's degree? Not trying to diminish what we do. What we do is really important, but disproportionately, people of color attain 4-year bachelor's degrees at a much lower rate than their majority counterparts. This is not a quota system. We're still trying to have a certain talent and a certain yield of talent. But, I'm questioning my team and I'm challenging my team and my leaders to begin thinking about what good looks like. And what good looks like does not always fit the mold of what we see the majority of the time.
Right. So what good looks like, Giselle, you were nodding and definitely co-signing Kimberlyn on that one.
I love that phrase. I may have to steal that. I'll quote you on it.
Steal shamelessly.
I love that idea of what good looks like. That's a beautiful way of talking about potential and not swaying a conversation. It's good. Right? I love it. It's very positive. So from my lens, because I was tasked to take on a very specific role that had goals associated with it. Technically, some of my role is to assess and report on for the UN Global Compact. So I have to report on those 2 metrics of how we're progressing on moving along on gender parity, how we're reducing inequality. And that means many different things, depending on the discipline, depending on the group. And as Kimberly, you mentioned, it looks very different depending on the office, on the group. It's a complex conversation. It's not a one size fits all. So it takes some time. I always say that JEDI is a process. It's not really a check in the box. It's not an answer to a question. It's a process about engagement. It's a process about acknowledgement and personal acknowledgement, self-awareness, and also what we're doing. So tasks oriented wise, I have to report to the UN Global Compact. I created the first metrics report that looks to analyze all the data within our organization from gender, race, LGBTQI status, breaking it down by practice, by gender, by role, also looking at our promotions process, how we promote, what impact data looks like. It's not the same thing as looking at your overall pool of candidates and then saying, well, we reached gender parity because we promoted 50% women and 50% men. How are you promoting women and men? Are you promoting more women to senior roles? Are you promoting more men to senior roles? So that kind of impact data is something that I'm very interested in understanding, and we have to really hold up a mirror and see what that looks like. We're doing that in hiring data as well. I love that you mentioned job descriptions. We're going through that process. Again, there needs to be some clarity and parity in job descriptions. And if you don't have something to look at, to kind of self-define what that role looks like, how you look at yourself in that role and what that role may reflect on other parts and pieces of the organization, it's really hard to figure out how you measure up. But something that I'm very grateful that we were able to do that too. We added a portion on each job description that talks about how you build culture. And it establishes, it's loose, right? It's a process. We're still trying to understand what that looks like for us. But we're adding community engagement. We're adding advocacy to that. We're adding other terminology that acknowledges if you want to be a great designer, you have to understand your community as well. You have to be a leader, a facilitator, a collaborator, a great listener. So we're adding some of that terminology to spark that acknowledgement that we value these things in the organization. So working on that, thankfully also I work within the talent space and the talent team at the enterprise. So I work collaboratively with HR, with talent acquisition, professional development, organizational development. My greatest partners are the marketing team, internally and externally, because there's so much about this work that it's about celebration. You have to celebrate the small wins, the big wins, and also track the work that you're doing. So they help me and they help the firm hold up a mirror internally and externally so that not only do we hold ourselves accountable, but others do too. And we encourage them also to join in that space. So it's a process.
Thank you for that. And you both mentioned the metrics, the numbers, the demographics, job descriptions. We know that bias can live in a lot of different places, and it isn't always very overt. It's often hidden. And so job descriptions are at the beginning of the process. And once someone joins your organization, are you all also looking at performance reviews? Because sometimes that's those systems by which we acknowledge and reward people. Sometimes there's bias inherent in that as well. Are you all looking at your performance review systems and how people are acknowledged and rewarded within your firms as well?
Absolutely. That is one of the big deliverables that I am delivering for the firm along with my team. And it's really helping us get to this notion of meritocracy, where you are really judging people based on objective data, and you are really promoting, rewarding those folks who are actually making the huge contributions for the firm. You can't completely pull the subjectivity out of it, but I can get darn close based on, cascading objectives. And what I've said to my two CEOs is starting 2022, come out at the beginning of the year and let everyone know what your goals are for the year. We know, as a leadership team, what the 5-year plan looks like, but going forward, back to Yazel's point about really communicating and over communicating internally and externally, let everyone at the firm know what your goals are so that they know where they sit, how it aligns with what you're trying to accomplish for the firm. And then that rolls down to the individual management level. We are going to insist upon goal setting every year. That's been done, kind of, in a fluid fashion, I'll say, over the course of the past several years. And, and we're no different than a lot of other firms and other organizations. Some people do it great. Some people, do it, not as great. But what I'm trying to put in place for the firm is really a practice and a rigor around sustained performance management and talent management metrics so that we begin to have more objective data from which to promote and reward and to begin building succession plans for the firm. I would love to see a day when, as we're continuing to grow and really evolve into the existing markets that we have and really move into these emerging markets that we're targeting, I'd love to see a day where more of our internal senior promotions are coming from within versus going from, or versus coming in from the external market. And that only happens when you have a really robust performance management and talent management system internally.
Yeah. Giselle, same question for you. Are you looking at the review process and performance differently?
It's funny enough, it's incredibly similar to what you're doing, Kimberly. And I kind of love that because it kind of reinforces it as well. I feel so much better about what we're doing. Thank you for that. We're doing very, very similarly. We're looking at cascading objectives. So
no way.
Yes, we're implementing cascading objectives using a platform. We're establishing those big picture objectives that align with our values at the organization that have to do with, of course, client relationships and diversity relationships, with our character of humility, integrity, and honesty, and purpose, right? Focus, determination, and achievement. So we're creating these big picture objectives that everybody in the organization has to acknowledge in some form or fashion. So the ESG umbrella has to be incorporated into those. And each sector, each practice, each office, each leader, including every person in the organization, has to align through those cascading objectives. And the goal is to make it very clear, transparent, organizationally as well, so that we can hold ourselves accountable and measure progress. Because if you don't really do that and everybody's sort of doing their own thing, it's hard to understand if you're really moving the needle and affecting change at a holistic level. So I love that we're doing the same things. One thing that I've also, because of what you're sort of mentioning, yes, we're trying to look inward, to really dig into our succession planning and our governance structure. Are we being intentional in thinking about the future of organization with the people that we have? Are we building the future leaders in the organization, giving them the resources that they need? We're looking into defining, there's a ton of data around high performance, or hypo, as we call high performers. But what are we defining internally at HKS is what we value for a high performer? What does that look like? And there are many, many different formats, but we want to distill what that means for us, establish a program that supports that, and then have it be also transparent so that people can know what the expectation is, what it looks like at the firm, and then provide them with a clear path. I think what most people need is, I want to know what I need to do in order to be better as a better teammate, better leader, better designer, better engager with the community. How can I be better in creating a product that serves everybody well? So I love that, as we're definitely talking about the same thing. And on the meritocracy thing, a nuanced piece that I learned for myself is meritocracy as it is defined, right? In this blue ocean world, meritocracy implies that we can truly view a person through their achievements. But what I've tried to do as well organizationally is acknowledge that the system is the base that we acknowledge people's achievement and performance. So I've tried to move away from meritocracy and encourage more of a conversation of acknowledgement of the systems that we have in place that enable or disable or hinder equity in the organization. But even just having that conversation of, yes, we definitely, in an ideal world, absolutely, we should value meritocracy. But we don't show up at the table all with the same resources and the same opportunity. So let's acknowledge that. It's been a complicated conversation. Of course, it's as with everything in the JEDI space. It's the nuances that then build on those cascading objectives. I love that. And really, as well as cascading, you're building up. You're building this framework in place that hopefully will sustain the organization, make it truly resilient long before, long after we're there.
And a quick clarification for our audience, the terminology that you're using, cascading objectives. Can one of you give a quick definition? My very pedestrian explanation is it objectives that spread throughout the organization either escalate, or I know that there was once upon a time a top-down maybe explanation, but if one or both of you can maybe give the HR speak and explain what cascading objectives are.
That's exactly right, Cheryl. It is those objectives that start at the highest, most part of the organization, and they cascade down throughout to the lowest level of the organization. But there is a linkage so that the most junior person within the organization understands how his or her role impacts the enterprise. And in our structure, because we have this firm-wide structure, but we also have the studio level, it's a little bit of a hybrid. So you have the firm-wide objectives in the process that we're implementing, but you also have those local things that may look a little bit differently as you go market to market. But at the end of the day, it is one IA, and it is one set of overall objectives that we should all be managing towards.
Great, thank you for that. Isel, did you want to add to that explanation, or you're good with that?
I was just going to give a quick example.
Yeah, perfect.
That, for example, we at HKS, we've defined, I think we have about 3 to 5 or 6, I can't remember right now because we're going through that process right now. We have big overarching objectives. One has to do with business acumen or professional development. One has to do with progress. They're just big overarching, large, big picture statements. And then each person in the organization ties into that objective through their key result. So an example of a key result could be, for example, for me, Blue Ocean, of course, I would like HKS to be the leading Jedi firm in the entire industry. That aligns with our ESG, UN Global Compact umbrella. So if you look physically, if you look at our database, they look cascading. My objective, my OKR, loops into the talent team, that loops into the CEO and overall big arching umbrella. So anybody that wants to do Jedi work loops into my OKR, and it continues to cascade until the action items then build on the work that we're doing to then make progress on the overarching objective for the organization.
So then goals are never really siloed. They're very aligned. The word that kind of keeps resonating for me is that there's an alignment that for staff and employees, your goals are very clearly connected to the larger goals of the organization.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Let me, I've got 2 different questions. Kimberlyn, I want to come to you. You've been in the HR space for about 20 years, right? And,
yes.
What are some effective strategies that you are seeing for creating a diverse and inclusive environment? And I'm going to be teeing you up, Isel, because you keep using the Jedi term, and so in your title, justice plays an important role. So I'm going to come to you with that after Kimberlyn talks a little bit about, kind of in this 20 years of experience you have in HR. Can you give for the audience what you've seen that's been most effective in creating an inclusive environment?
This is going to seem remarkably simple, my answer. But my answer is having leaders who have the courage to say, this is not right. Having leaders who have the courage to say, there is something amiss and I want to do something about it. At the end of the day, they know. It's never a newsflash moment. We all know. We may not talk about it, but we know. I work for 2 CEOs who know that there is a huge opportunity to have an organization that looks more reflective of the communities in which we do business. And I mean meaningful representation. I'm not saying go out and hire a bunch of folks to work in the mailroom. Anyone can do that. That's a quota system. I'm talking about meaningful representation across the firm, up and down the firm, meaningful representation, even looking at where we spend our dollars. How are we helping and impacting those smaller, more disadvantaged businesses that are right down the street from us? Are we doing something to make sure that they know that IA is in their neighborhood and that we're open for business, that we're open for partnerships with your business? So having leaders that make it a priority, and then hiring someone with, like myself, with my background, and giving me the resources and the access and the space and the support to go off and implement our strategy. That is the big difference in some of the work that I've seen fail in the past.
Yeah.
And some of the work that I'm seeing move very quickly in just the short 6 months that I've been at IA. One really interesting example that I'll share with you. Again, I know that this feels very simplistic, but it's really hard work, and it is work that never ends. I don't view any of this work that we're talking about as having an end date. It is something that we should all be talking about, because we should all be assessing the health of our organization and how well we're doing. In a past life, long time ago, public company, billion-dollar company that you all would probably recognize if I called it out, but I won't. It wouldn't be appropriate. Very quickly, they wanted to answer the call for DE&I. We've all seen that work before. Or I'm sorry, we've all seen that put in place before. It's not authentic. It wasn't tied to a business strategy, but we wanted to put something in place very quickly to say that we had a program and it was important to us. We quickly pulled together a diversity council. There were no people of color on the diversity council. There were 2 women out of 10 on the diversity council, and it was all made up of senior executives. What do you think the outcomes from that council were going to yield for that firm?
Not a lot. I think I know that example. It's one of those textbook examples in that particular company. I think the magic number is they spent $233 million on that effort, and it went exactly nowhere.
Exactly. When you fast forward to the fortune that I have now to be working for, 2 great leaders who make this a priority, who want to see differences, who want to see meaningful change, sustainable change, and want all of this change, by the way, to not be done in reaction to anything other than making us a very, very open, inclusive company in which to do business. I mean, one of our core values is that we're not pretentious. And we're not. I cannot even get my 2 CEOs to do a commercial, because at the end of the day, it's about the work.
Yeah.
They don't care about being on stage, quote unquote. It is about the work, and it is about our people. My title is Chief People Officer by design. It's not Chief Human Resources Officer. People is one of our values. Diversity is one of our values. Being unpretentious is one of our values. So when you think about who we are, especially around this equity and inclusion conversation, it really is coming to life, and it has been a part of how we do business and how we lead and live at IA.
Well, and your core DNA is critical. No matter the organization, the core DNA, your values as an organization are critical. So playing a bit with what you just said and how you started that, Kimberlyn, with knowing is the first step and doing, right, is the second step. Isel, that very deliberate and intentional addition to your title, or in your title, of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. How did that come about? I'm resisting every urge that I have to call you a Jedi Knight, but that's so critical. And how was that conversation? How did that happen within HKS?
Well, I'm much like Kimberlyn. I'm very fortunate to work with a CEO that drove this work, this alignment with the UN Global Compact, that pushed for my role as part of the strategic visioning for the organization. So I'm very fortunate in that space. My original title was Director of EDI. And so I started in 2019. At the end of 2019, I was starting to really dig into this work because I was, as I always say, I came in at this as a medical planner and an architect, having done this work in associations. It's not the same thing. So I was doing a lot of reading and research, and thankfully I had a really great relationship with Rosa Chang and Brian Lee and Brian C. Lee. And I was really listening to the overall conversation of why, if we really want to do this work and do it well, we need to acknowledge, and I mentioned this before, we need to acknowledge the systems that enable or hinder progress in this work. And in order to do that, you need to acknowledge justice, to dismantle the barriers of access to success. So my definition for justice is actively dismantling the barriers
Love that.
to access for opportunities.
I love that.
So I know within the industry, at least in architecture, we define justice as the policies and the practices that we implement in an organization that create the bedrock of the work that we're doing.
Mhm.
Equity is the framework, the
Mhm.
access to those pieces and how people feel enabled to access those resources and opportunities. So as I was getting myself more deeply ingrained in this work, and I was part of AIA and the Equity Equity in the Future of Architecture Committee, for me, it was imperative to acknowledge where we are today in the context of the United States. I also didn't grow up here. I grew up in Puerto Rico, in a colony of the US. So my lens is a little bit different, I guess, because I'm constantly acknowledging feeling the colonized mentality as something that I have to actively work through as a person, as a human being, and also as I show up in the workplace. So acknowledging the systems was very important for me. Dismantling the systems will always be something very important. And we can't really create equity if we don't acknowledge the system to disruptive, dismantle. And then really, as we always talk about JEDI or JEDI, but sometimes I know trying to align it with Lucasfilms and JEDI is probably not the best thing to do. It's kind of a great, we want to do that. It's kind of innate. But the idea is, and I think Brian Seeley has mentioned this and Rosa Cheng as well, justice and equity equal diversity and inclusion. I want to take it farther than that and say JEDI is the process that gets us to belonging and true psychological safety.
Yeah.
So if we don't acknowledge those three things, give people agency, but also the opportunity to challenge and innovate, then we will never get to the space of belonging, which is where we want to get to. So if in an ideal world, I would be the chief belonging officer or something like that in an organization. But that's a process. That's the process.
That is the work that you all are invested in. And Cheryl Kern was able to join us. Thank you so much, Cheryl. We are deep into a phenomenal discussion, and I want to take a moment for everyone in the audience knows that you were coming. You had some transit issues, so we're glad that you're here. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing with MillerKnoll? And you have a collection of companies under that now new MillerKnoll brand, and how you are talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion across multiple brands. So welcome, we're glad you're here.
Thank you so much. And thanks you guys for letting me be part of this today. You know, I think for us, we attempt to keep this fairly practical and simplistic and straightforward, because we do, to your point, Cheryl, we have so many brands and there are so many individual cultures, right, that exist, and different business models, et cetera. I think part of our focus on ensuring that we first seek to understand before actually determining, you know, what steps we might be taking or need to take from looking at it through the DEI lens has been something that's been critically important for us. You know, we also have not, and I think this is a tribute to our leadership, our focus has not been to have a timeline that says we're going to force something to happen in terms of making it become a cultural fit, because this is really, you know, all of these integrations are really part of a broader change management sort of initiative. And so as a result of that, I think just an intentional focus on first seeking to listen and to understand, and then seeking to align has really been something that has helped us along our DE&I journey. And for people to feel that they're being respected, that perhaps the way that they went about doing something that was different perhaps than the masses were doing, that's okay. And we need to understand from each other and learn and then adopt what those best practices are. And so that's really been at the core of a lot of our integration efforts, which I think aligns really nicely to kind of being respectful and seeking understanding as you look at all of this through the DE&I lens.
Thank you for that. knowing that this work that you all are doing, the work that is happening at firms globally, it's longitudinal. It is, it's, you don't flip a switch. It's not, it's not a check mark, task oriented, we're done. How are you assessing your work internally and over time? And what's the kind of assessment maybe structure? How does your team, how does leadership know you are successful at achieving your EDI goals? Anybody want to talk about assessment and what assessment maybe and accountability looks like at your organization?
I think because I showed up late, I'm probably due to come up with another answer.
Okay,
I'm probably a
that's
little
fine.
bit behind.
Fair enough.
And thank you very much. My flight was delayed. Great question, Cheryl. If it matters, you have to measure it. And so we have not only a corporate scorecard that really creates that accountability for all of the measures of our business that matter, but we incorporate our DEI accountabilities into that same corporate scorecard.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, that's really, it hasn't been a game changer, but it certainly has held us to be accountable. And we've actually even taken that to a different level this year with some new levels of accountability for anyone who is a director and above, and had some new accountabilities that have been approved by our board of directors. We also have, through our employee engagement practice, we've implemented 2 years ago an inclusive index that allows us to really measure across difference and demographics what people of color and underrepresented groups are saying about how the culture feels to them. So those are just a few.
Okay. And anything with customers, anything with clients, customers, end users, are they a part of this assessment and accountability piece?
Yes, very much. Lots of surveying, lots of feedback, their expectations are also factored into our corporate scorecard in a very significant way. And so I would say at the highest level, there's just tons of assessment and feedback that's underway from our client standpoint, because at the end of the day, that's really what fuels the growth of the company.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Let me ask you all one quick question. Let's be honest. We're in a moment, right, of the Great Resignation, and people are making pivots and moves and thinking differently about where they want to work, how they want to work. How are you thinking about recruitment differently, and are your organizations recruiting differently than they did maybe 5 years ago?
We've had to.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had to think completely differently about how work gets done and where work gets done. We design, beautiful workspaces. So we are not looking towards a day where no one ever shows up in the office or in the studio in our case. We do believe that the best work product comes from us working together collaboratively and, putting our heads together and making a beautiful end product. And then when you think about just succession, mentorship, grooming, those more junior designers in the firm, to be ready for, roles of greater experience and responsibility. A lot of that mentorship comes from working together in the office or in the studio. But we've had to think about how we hire, and we've had to be very, very flexible. A lot of people will never want to go back to the way that things used to be, pre-pandemic. And, and I'm working with my leaders right now to really ask the question, what has to happen, to hit the success profile, and what are you just more comfortable managing? Mm-hmm. Because I would argue if you're doing a great job of, goal setting, going back to the whole performance management discussion that we had previously, whether you're in the studio or whether you're at home or whether you're on the beach, if I'm managing performance and holding you accountable for a set of goals and deliverables, where you deliver that and how you deliver it, we're going to have to think about more flexibility to attract that top talent. The Great Resignation, I believe, is going to continue on into Q1 of 22. And so I think we as leaders have to be really mindful and sensible and really think a little bit proactively about what we're going to put in place to attract people who have decided that, you know, lifestyle is now almost equally as important to having a successful career.
Mhm, mhm. And from an inclusion standpoint, I certainly hear from a number of firms who, had never actively or intentionally recruited from HBCUs. Kimberly, you mentioned that you went to Howard University. And so even the places that firms are recruiting from have necessarily needed to shift as well.
Yes, absolutely. And, and I am challenging my team to take a look at every HBCU with accredited design and architecture programs. There is no reason why we should not know who they are and make a meaningful effort to begin to build relationships with those schools.
Mhm.
And in some of my markets, we have high schools that are even beginning to introduce these sorts of career opportunities to their students. A lot of times it's just about knowing. I grew up in a really, really small town in middle Georgia, and I would tell you on career day, it was never an architect that showed up.
Mhm.
In Middletown, Georgia, it was public safety. It was someone from the armed forces, and it was maybe, a physician or someone from the medical services.
Mhm.
All great professions, but as we all know, there's so many more opportunities out there. Everyone can't be a physician. Everyone, isn't, ready to be a public servant. But what else is out there? And so I believe just by exposing people to the world of design and helping them to understand what it is that we do and how they can play into this space and have a meaningful and impactful career while doing so, we owe it to ourselves and to our communities to begin to tell the story to those people who wouldn't otherwise even know that we exist.
Exactly. Expanding that design conversation to zip codes where the design conversations haven't always happened. Cheryl,
Certainly
or
not in my
Giselle?
town. Two
Yeah.
stoplights, Cheryl.
Yeah. Giselle or Cheryl Kern, any comments on recruiting, and are you recruiting differently and thinking about other places to recruit from than kind of where you have typically?
We have started to have a very candid conversation about affinity bias.
Mm.
And affinity bias, what that looks like for alumni, what that looks like for relationships, and intentionally seeking out HBCUs, embracing programming with them long-term. So for example, HKS, we have partnered with Prairie View University because our biggest office is in Texas. We have three offices in Texas, and we want to build a very strong relationship with Prairie View, and we've committed to a 5-year program to support them. We provide a scholarship for a student, but we not only do that, we also become a trusted partner to all the professors as an academic institution, and hopefully build strong relationships with each of the professors and the students so that there's longevity and sort of increasing the pipeline. We're doing that with Howard University. We've been doing that with Tuskegee. So we're trying to be very intentional in building a strong, intentional relationship, a meaningful relationship with all 7 HBCUs to start. We're now also expanding to interior design where these spaces are. And as Kimberly mentioned, supporting high schools that also have STEM tracks or architecture tracks and fund them, support them. But we want to be always a trusted ally and advisor for them. It's not just going and giving them money, which is very needed. Absolutely, it's very needed. But we want them to know that we're partners to them at every phase of the project. We want to review portfolios. We want to mock interviews. We want to support the programming because accreditation is also changing and shifting. So we want to be mindful that the business is changing, so academia needs to change, and we need to be supportive of the work that they're doing so that then we get the best students as well. We want to build that relationship. We want to be a little selfish too.
Yeah.
But then we have to put in the time, the money, and the energy to do that.
Yeah.
And that means being present with them along the entire spectrum of the process.
So here's a question from the audience, and it's popped up from a number of people, and clearly people are wanting some help and some support and some advice in their own organizations. What is the best way to introduce DE&I ideas, suggestions, frameworks to leadership teams that are 100% white males? So that question has popped up multiple times. How do you avoid pushback and establish trust in a process of creating a safe, equitable, and enjoyable environment for everyone. So that's popped up in many incarnations, but we all kind of know what the design industry looks like. Kimberlin, you've talked about, as well as Isel and Cheryl, I'm obviously familiar with your organization, that having that open leadership, that leadership that acknowledges that there are disparities and inequities that exist. But what happens when you maybe don't have that open-minded leadership and you need to have this tough conversation, because there are firms out there that aren't having this conversation? So what advice would you give to the folks who are asking this question to help them start this conversation in their organizations?
So if you've started at the top and you can't find anyone to listen, go to level 2. If you can't find anyone at level 2, go to level 3. Meet the organization where it is. You'll find someone who understands that this is important and who understands the business outcomes from having, and the business, really the game-changing business from having a diverse population within the firm. In a past life, the same place where they have the all-white diversity council, I found a level 2 leader. And he gave me money from his budget to build diversity and equity programs for the firm. He owned about 60% of the firm's revenues. I was his HR leader, and this was very important to him. And I found him and he found me. And in our own little space, without completely shaking up the whole system that was not quite ready to go to that part of the journey with us, we did what we could, to impact change from our little space, of the company. And with him, I was able to build out a talent management program where we held ourselves accountable and we held our leaders accountable to always have diverse slates when we were hiring, and to also have diverse slates when we were promoting. There was no reason why, not saying that everyone was going to get hired that was on that slate who was a diverse person, but we're challenging you to look for diverse people to include on that slate. There has to be some that are qualified. We began going into the communities. We found those organizations, those schools with whom we could partner to begin to tell the story, again, from our space, not firm-wide, but just from our space within the company. And slowly but surely, he and I began to move the needle. He and I did this kind of covert operation for 4 years. And slowly but surely, as leadership changed at the top, mind you, he was level 2, we began to be able to then take what we were doing and make it more of a level 1 focus. And so I would tell you to be tenacious, continue to poke and probe and sell the story. And if the level 1 people, are not ready to have the conversation, or they just don't, for whatever reason, think it is a worthwhile conversation to have it with a peer, have it with a subordinate. Because at the end of the day, D&I starts at the top, I believe, but it is really about everyone at every level of the organization doing their part.
And it's not just, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Cheryl.
I was just going to add really quickly, just building upon what Kimberlin just said. I think at the core, DE&I has to be, we have a responsibility. We've got to be the catalyst. I know for Isel, for Kimberlin, for myself, all of us are frequently approached by people that can't find their seat at the table. They don't know how to penetrate. And so we're really the catalyst for the organization. We can't carry all the water, we can't do all the work, but we have to be that safe space that people can come to. And then it's our responsibility to create platforms and avenues and access for those folks whose voices can't be heard. We do that in multiple ways at Miller Knoll.
Mm-hmm.
I lead our Global DEI Council. And if I'm hearing enough of something that's going on, I put it on the agenda. It's my responsibility to get it right in front of the full leadership team. We also have our equity teams, which are our ERGs, and it's often bubbling up through them. We now, as you know, Cheryl, we have our diversity in design initiative. that's
Mhm.
made up now of 50 different companies that have come together to say, we're going to change the game of design and move from this 4% of Black designers at least up to the 13% of the population. And so I think our role is really to be the catalyst that is making the connections and influencing the change, because we can't always be the one to carry the water. Last thing I wanted to say is that last night in Chicago, and Cheryl, I had hoped to have been with you because we had this leadership workshop last night, but I was virtual for it. There was a question that was raised. It was a DEI workshop for a leadership team, one of our top leadership teams. And the question was raised by someone, what do I do when my worst offender is my best performer? And this is often what we see happen in the business. And so our role is really, to make sure that we are being that catalyst for change and making sure that we're, moving things in the direction that they need to move so we can get the impact that we want around DE&I. And it's not easy work. It's the long game that we're all in for together. But I just think it's critically important that we're not always the ones trying to do it, but we're bringing other people along with us and inserting them in.
Yeah, and it's not just that moral and ethical imperative. It's a business and an economic imperative. And I know that many people have had success in encouraging a conversation about DE&I when they talk about the money. Companies that are high performers within the realm of DE&I are also better performers from a financial perspective, and that's publicly held and privately held, you name it. And there are any number of case studies out there that demonstrate the numbers behind DE&I from a success standpoint as well. It is 1 minute to the hour, and I think we're going to need a part 2 of this conversation. I can't get enough of Ezell and Kimberlyn and Cheryl, and I can't thank you all for demonstrating your leadership, your commitment to equity, inclusion, diversity, and justice. Thank you so much for joining us. I salute each of you and to the foresight of your organizations as well. Thanks so much to each of you. Thanks to the audience. I wish that we could get more questions in there. The recording will be available.